It's Friday once again, David, and we are back. Good to see you. How are you feeling today, David?
Very well, thank you, Jason. It's good to be with you.
I think everybody is concerned whether they're in the United States or Canada. We've been talking a lot about what's going on at these residential schools in Canada. I think most people are shocked. Hasn't been too much new reporting about that I've seen this week, but we've put together a collage today, David, that features now one of my favorite images of Pierre Elliott Trudeau basically giving the world the finger and his stupid son at the helm now. What do we want to talk about today?
Well, I think that's right. I think Americans may tend to think that there's nothing very much interesting going north of the border. But I would say Canada represents one of the greatest threats to the survival of the Republic during its lifetime, which people may find bizarre, but a little bit of history on Pierre Trudeau. He's a Fabian socialist, right? Which basically means it's the practice or the idea of eugenics and population control and centralized credit and government by elite bureaucrats. And he's been very successful because he and his son have slithered past the radar of the collective intelligence services, if that's not an oxymoron, of the Five Eyes countries. And basically they're so deep inside your government, the United States government and the Five Eyes, that the intelligence services don't even know they're there.
Well, I think
that's kind of frightening.
It's true of Canada, isn't it?
Yes, the Five Eyes countries. Remember what's President Xi said, that he's going to blind or pluck the Five Eyes if they persist in objecting to the tragedy in Hong Kong and the oppression of the local people there. So, well, you're plucked, Jason. We are plucked, right? And our citizens, we the people, don't even know. But fortunately, I believe you and I and our listeners, the A team, right, have worked our way into the mindset of the enemy, and that's a basic principle of the art of war. If you're going to win your war, you have to know your enemy and know yourself, right? Yeah. And I would say that collectively, the intelligence services of the Five Eyes countries don't know who the enemy is. They're looking outside instead of inside. But let's just go back to your master collage and some of these characters. So in the foreground on the left is a man called Christopher Charles Ingveldsson. And I don't know, there's something really creepy about this guy's face and his pursed lips. Yeah. But, maybe I'm judging too much, but if we know a little more about him, Americans should wake up. This guy was the roommate of Justin Trudeau from 1997 to 2001, and he wasn't arrested until 2010, and he was charged and convicted for directing, and incarcerated ultimately, for directing an international pedophile ring. And I think the balance of probability is that the international pedophile ring that he'd established or was directing had been built over decades, and I would call it now the SOS Children's Villages Network.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because I don't mean to derail you from Ingveldsson. He's quite a weirdo, and somebody's got this picture of him wearing a lampshade or whatever, and there's been virtually no news about him since then. But the SOS Villages, David, that's like an NGO. It's a charity. What does Ingveldsson have to do with that?
Well, the CEO of SOS Children's Villages in, I think, May of this year, wrote or prepared or offered a press release or a statement apologizing for what I infer from the way she's written it, and the scope of what she's written is institutionalized pedophilia within the SOS Children's Villages, which is the world's largest child orphanage with a presence in 152 countries. And if you look at this and the grooming potential for the children going through these villages is immense, because very often children, let's say in Angola or Rwanda or South Africa, their parents have been killed, and a significant number of the children have been child soldiers, where the girls become prostitutes and wash the clothing and, I don't know, polish the guns of the thugs at the top of the pile there. And the boys quite often become sexual partners of the men. And ultimately, you have 152 countries participating blindly in this charity. And they are deep inside the government and, of course, could be used potentially. I mean, I think we'll be able to prove it one day as pedophile brothels. Now,
it's a really troubling set of allegations, and obviously confirmed there by the CEO of the thing. This is the website dw.com saying Austria's children's NGO, non-government organization, faces sex abuse claims, and some SOS Kinderdorf staff members allegedly knew about the sexual abuse and other violence, but tried to cover it up. Wow. I mean, it's remarkably similar to what we've been hearing. You know, suddenly we have all these mass graves. Obviously, there's abuse if people are being killed. This is stunning.
Right. And so we go along that timeline with the residential schools and back to when Pierre Trudeau reared his ugly head for the first time. Well, I mean, maybe it was ugly much before. But in 1949, he went on his world tour, funded by his daddy's money, and he visited all the greatest despots that he could find. He was a great fan of Mao Zedong and Stalin. He was a Stalinist, I would argue, depopulationist, and he considered himself, I think, or the people around him, rather misled, believed he was an elite intellectual. Well, I don't know what your opinion of this guy is, or my opinion. Maybe it doesn't matter, but all of these people have feet of clay. And of course, if they get where they get through the exploitation or the sexual exploitation of children, I think we, the people, should smarten up and make sure that A, their reputation comes down, a bit like Jimmy Savile. Maybe their graves should be scattered, right, and thrown into the sea.
Did they do that to Jimmy Savile?
Yeah, I think, well, he up to the time the children or the victims exposed him, he had a gravestone and somewhere, but I think now that gravestone has been removed, and I don't know if they've dug up his bits, what's left of his body bits, and scattered them around. But anyway, he was an animal and probably the most prolific sexual offender of children, ensconced in and protected by the BBC.
Holy crap. Look at this, David. They have a gravesite here with like that, I mean, it's basically got this, it's almost like that picture of him chomping the cigar. And look at this, he's got a crucifix on there. That's, wow.
Yeah, so maybe you can flip to the crucifix image outside Broadcasting House, where the sexualized boy Christ is being crucified, serenaded by a couple of angel figures. Yeah, the one around the corner. Because I think our listeners should be able to follow this, or it will help them to follow this, if they look at the symbols, the migration of symbols. I think there's a wonderful book I read as a teenager called The Migration of Symbols. I don't know if I understood it at the time, but the meaning of symbols changes very slowly over time, but it can be adopted, but it does provide a sort of genetic thread, if you will. If we look at this statue, carving outside, sorry, which, if we stay on that, let's okay, sorry, we're shuffling back. Let's stay with that
I'm
one.
just A-Bing it.
Oh, okay. So this is A, right? And there you have an older Ariel, I think. In Ariel is the name of the little boy on the other statue, but let's stay with this one at the moment. So this is in the spread eagle posture of a crucifixion, and he's being serenaded by two winged figures, one of whom is holding a flute, I guess, and the other is holding a book with a carved inscription on it, to the genitals or private parts of the naked sexualized boy Christ. And this has been outside Broadcasting House since 1934. And you and I were there, of course, in January in an epic trip where, amongst others, we went on that Jack the Ripper tour, but I digress. Right. So the carving, the inscription says Obsculta, which means listen and obey. Now, wouldn't it be interesting if SOS Children's Villages, which started in 1949, and prior to that, the Indian residential schools were grooming children to become spies within the Five Eyes countries, if you will, and basically listen and obey. So when you turned them on, you could turn them off, and maybe these children were being groomed for sexual entrapment and blackmail. So maybe we should go back down the timeline of some of our fearsome leaders and look at, I don't know,
wait
Bill
a second.
Clinton.
So 1949, the SOS Children thing is founded, right?
Yes.
But what about?
And I think that.
What?
Go ahead.
What do you think?
I think in reality, although there was a name assigned to the founding of SOS Children Villages, I think he was an Austrian guy. I believe where Pierre Trudeau and Maurice Strong, who was a sociopathic Stalinist depopulationist, was very important at the time. In 1949, Pierre Trudeau was cruising around the world on his daddy's money, right? Having been to the Sorbonne, Harvard, and the London School of Economics, and come back, I presume, an avid practitioner of British Fabianism. And Maurice Strong was squatting in the United Nations in New York as a junior security officer. And he would go on to become probably one of the most dangerous men on the planet that aided significantly in the deindustrialization of the United States of America, right? So now these two, yes, there we are. We got.
Well, so now wait a second. We got to talk about this guy for a second, because you've told me about him before, and also Charles Ortel has referred to him as a UN puke, which I think that's probably right. But there's something here, David, that I want to read to you. This is November 28th, 2015, a statement by the Prime Minister on the death of Maurice Strong. Now, of course, this would be Justin, but he says, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, issued the following statement today after learning of the death of Maurice Strong. I was very saddened to learn of the death of Maurice Strong on behalf of all Canadians. Sophie and I offer our deepest condolences to his family, friends, and colleagues. Mr. Strong was an internationally recognized environmentalist and philanthropist who used his remarkable business acumen, organizational skills, and humanity to make the world a better place. Something of a subjective statement, David. In his career, he took on extraordinarily challenging positions at the United Nations, including Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. That sounds like eugenics to me. He was also first executive director of the United Nations Environment Program, executive, British spelling, by the way, and Maurice Strong, he's an American guy, executive coordinator, although I guess Trudeau would spell it like that, of the United Nations Office for Emergency Operations in Africa, where a lot of these SOS villages are. And he was a member of the World Commission on Environment and Development. More recently, Mr. Strong was Secretary General of the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. He was a driving force behind achieving the Kyoto Protocol. In addition, he was considered a legend at the Canadian International Development Agency, and he headed earlier in his career. So was Strong Canadian or American?
Canadian.
Sorry. For his work, Mr. Strong received numerous conservation and humanitarian awards, as well as honorary doctorates from multiple universities. He was a companion of the Order of Canada and a member of the Queen's Privy Council. So that's how he would have gotten to know Pierre Trudeau. Mr. Strong was a global pioneer of sustainable development who left our country and our world a better place. His accomplishments will be remembered and honored for years to come. Honorary scumbag, David.
A dishonorable scumbag and a very dangerous
Indeed.
That basically, for example, kicked off the Chicago Climate Exchange, was a great scam in terms of laundering the money through these carbon dioxide credits. And let me just take, and I don't want to lecture people on carbon dioxide, but just make a little point. Carbon dioxide is God's gas, all right? It's wholly transparent, odorless, and is a fundamental fertilizer gas that makes the plants green, right? And it exists in trace quantities. these guys, I mean, they're so dumb, they don't even know what percentage of carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere. That is to say, made by man or anthropogenic carbon dioxide. But in fact, I'll give you, it's 19 parts per million. It's extremely difficult to measure. If these Fabians wiped out humanity, no one would be able to measure the resulting difference in carbon dioxide, all right? And it has a zero effect on the climate other than a slight insulation effect that prevents or slows down the rate of cooling of the planet. Anyway, I digress. But this guy is a fraudster and a scampster. He lived out his last years in China, but he was an avid fan of Mao Zedong and a great friend of Pierre Trudeau. I believe he mentored Pierre Trudeau.
Aha.
So you've got these guys slithering into an operation. And if we go to the other carving outside Broadcasting House, I think I did a little research on, this is Prospero and Ariel. Prospero, the bearded guy clutching a naked boy between his knees in a very suggestive manner, is a magician. And Ariel is a sprite, as it's called, with a flute, who can be dispatched by Prospero to go and, I don't know, cause chaos. Like in the case of the show, The Tempest, he was sent to create a storm which shipwrecked the ship. I mean, right? So I sent you a little note on a distress call in South Africa, which is burning at the moment, because I believe these kinds of people, actually, from a Fabian point of view, you have to dismantle the protection of society before you build your Fabian revolution, right? So the BBC is actually a champion, I suggest, of Fabianism, and an immensely powerful and dangerous one, because it has a global network of what are called BBC studios. There's one in New York, and I think we now have evidence they're all connected by fiber optics. And this network is now what you might call the imperial brain that used to be occupied by the instrument room of the General Post Office in the 19th century, where all the cables coming from overseas would bring in messages that could make people extremely wealthy, right?
Wow,
you might
David,
find out. Go ahead.
look at this. Published in June 1948, The American Fabian Movement by Thomas P. Jenkin, University of California. Are you aware of this book? We can download it.
No.
Oh. American Fabian socialism was established in what seemed to be propitious circumstances. Propitious. Well, there we go. I'm not immediately propitious. What do they mean by that? I should look that up.
Means very favorable circumstances.
Okay. Its inauguration occurred in a period that had produced a proliferation of populist ideas. This author should eschew obfuscation, David. Write a little bit more clearly so dumb people like me can understand it. Its leaders included men of capacity and enthusiasm. What the hell does that mean? But in spite of these advantages, American Fabian endured for less than a decade. I don't believe that. I think this right away in one paragraph. I think Thomas P. Jenkin is a Fabian, writing in favor of the Fabians.
Absolutely, and hidden from plain view.
Right. Who is Thomas P. Jenkin?
Well, I don't know, but that's University of California, and the art of Fabianism, of course, is to stay hidden for as long as you can until the public wakes up and it's too late, right? Because you've lost your freedom.
Yes.
But
isn't that the writing of someone who considers himself an intellectual elite using obscure words that are maybe not that well?
Well, that's right. So for what it's worth, I make a distinction between intelligent, and I hope I am, or I'm generally recognized as reasonably intelligent, but I despise or object to the term intellectual, because when an intellectual has said something in 3 or 4 paragraphs, you then ask yourself, what the hell have they said?
Right.
However, that doesn't prevent them from being extremely self-satisfied and ambitious in a way that is not in the interests of we the people. Because coming back to, let's call them Fabian intellectuals, they believe in eugenics and population control, centralized credit, and government by elite bureaucrats, which is what's happened to the United States. Right now, you are in the throes or the victims of a Fabian revolution, and the majority of you, certainly it's happened, but it's too late in Canada maybe, you don't even know it. And your
Mm.
intelligence services have been looking in the wrong direction. So let's go back to just the career path or the impact that this guy, Christopher Ingvelson, might have had after he joined Justin Trudeau as a roommate in Vancouver around the 1996-97 period. I believe Christopher Charles Ingvelson started directing an international pedophile ring in 97 with Justin Trudeau, because I cannot conceive of sharing a room with someone who becomes my best friend for 4 years, right? Where, let's say, Ingvelson is the director of an international pedophile ring without the knowledge and consent and probably the active participation of Justin Trudeau, right? So when we hear these crocodile tears of Justin Trudeau for the children
Right.
buried in unmarked graves in the residential school, I think he's the ultimate hypocrite, right? I think he's dumb as a bag of hammers, whether he's considered himself as an intellectual or not. And what we see here on your marvelous collage is an indication that the SOS children's villages and the residential schools were set up to groom what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, would have called in perhaps 1980, when he wrote his thesis at Princeton, um, a critical analysis of revolutionary guerrilla organizations in theory and practice. Now, wasn't such an organization assembled on the steps of the Capitol building on January the 6th? Wasn't that a revolutionary guerrilla organization?
Well, and I don't know if you caught this comment from Mark Milley just a couple of weeks ago, but he said he wants to understand white rage. So that's a term I've never heard before he said it. And he's basically codified it, put it out there into the public consciousness here. This is the thing, the Mark Alexander Milley senior thesis, 185 pages. You got to go there to get it, on-site access. I've been meaning to want to make this reading room request.
Yeah, my theory is anytime I waste reading their garbage, right, is time taken away from what you and I do, I believe, very effectively, which is cut through all of the intellectual gobbledygook or doublespeak in Orwellian terms, right, and get to the heart of their conspiracy and then take it apart, right? I mean, my objective now is the destruction of Fabian socialism and the exposure of its exponents, right? Where some of them, I think their gravestones should be removed and their ashes scattered into the ocean. But maybe that's white rage, and just so happens I'm right, right?
But I'm saying, don't we want to read what he has to say so we can, I mean, there's going to almost undoubtedly be stupid statements in there that can give us some insight into this dope who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We should remind people, David, the power that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff hold. Back in the day when Kennedy was the president, it was this group that presented him with Operation Northwoods as a plan that they wanted to use to basically stage terrorist activities on civilian targets in the United States and then blame it on Cuba. And there seems to be a lot of stuff going on in Cuba right now.
Well, right. So let's just think of, if I was a Fabian, if I was a Pierre Trudeau, and my goal was to overthrow the Republic and dismantle the Five Eyes intelligence network, and I'm a Fabian and I've got certain techniques and networks in place, how would I do that? Let's say, just take 9/11. So in the run up to 9/11, the Department of Justice, which I believe has been totally infiltrated by these people, did something amazing and treasonous, in my opinion. May the 1st of 2001, it outsourced the operation of the asset forfeiture fund to a company called Maximus. And then Maximus took on about 180 subcontractors through a subcontractor front called PRM. And these people were DEA, FBI, CIA, and a whole bunch of people. And their job was to track the assets of criminal organizations, both presumably in the United States and around the world. That is to say, many of those operations would have been RICO enterprises, right?
This
And
is
so
stunning.
now
Let's just pause on this for a second, David. This is a press release here from the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of the Inspector General. And I don't see the date here. Do you see a date on this?
no, but I know it was around May the 1st of 2000. I think it was on May Day 2001.
They're saying the DOJ, Office of Inspector General, releases report on DEA, the department. Wait a minute, aren't they the guys who claimed to assassinate the Haiti president? DEA asset forfeiture program. Contracts awarded to Maximus Inc. for
Correct.
financial investigative services. Why do we want to give a contract to a company to investigate things? I thought we want the police. I mean, this is like the primary purpose of the government is to investigate and prevent crime.
Yeah, they outsourced
Allegedly.
the FBI, right? No,
Right.
let me just quickly respond to that. So at that time, May the 1st of 2001, the director of the FBI was a guy called Louis Freeh,
Oh
who I
boy.
think it was Opus Dei, and I believe they put barbed wire around their thighs in order not to get too excited if they're in the vicinity of something sexually stimulating.
Wait
Maybe
a
that's
second.
just
Hold on a second. Opus Dei, what is that?
Opus Dei. It's a Jesuit order, right? That has a certain rigid faith and structure. Anyway, I don't want to get too
What are
far.
they doing with barbed wire?
Well, if a man, presumably a man, or I don't know if a woman, is tempted by an opposite sex, you do realize that the assassin of John Wilkes Booth, remember, right, was assassinated. This is a digression. It's going to take us too far away from where I want to
But
go.
this
Let's
sounds
just
pretty
say
weird.
it is, right? But you'll be able to find that amongst the annals of monks who spend long times in isolation and maybe have dreams that get them excited. So they used to, as a form of penance, put barbed wire around their thighs. But all of these stories, they're too interesting to take us away from, what we need to do. Louis Freeh resigned in June. Now, why did he resign? I think Louis Freeh resigned as the director of the FBI because he knew he couldn't stop the 9/11 attack. And he knew that by outsourcing the asset forfeiture fund, the Department of Justice had put or empowered a group of criminals to get together to do some of the most egregious crimes in American history, including triggering a catastrophe bond with both towers coming down. But again, I digress. In June the 1st and 2nd of 2001, there was an exercise. And I think that was a top-off exercise, a top officials exercise, to see if America could respond to a hijacking attack. So that was called Amalgam Virgo. Remember, we've often put up the images of Amalgam Virgo, and that was staged on the 1st and 2nd of June of 2001. And on the front page of the briefing note, you got a picture of Osama bin Laden. So I'm sure Louis Freeh was no fool. He would look at that and say, hey, these guys are rehearsing the 9/11 attack, right?
Well,
look at it, 1st and 2nd of June of 2001. So he
again, we
knows he
don't know
can't stop.
the origin of this. I don't disagree with what you're saying, but there's other interesting things that actually just came up yesterday in the conversation with Jack Cashel. Louis Freeh was the head of the FBI during the TWA 800 crash, and in 1997, he decided that there was no missile, there was no friendly fire, it just was the fuel tank exploded out of nowhere, which had never happened before or since on a 747. And I agree with you, David. I think there was something in that TWA 800 that has somehow a connection to 9/11. There was a whole Ramzi Youssef connection.
Well, that's all right. So we have to ask ourselves, why would Louis Freeh, let's assume he's a good guy, why would he not appear to do the right thing? And then I believe you come back to Christopher Charles Ingwertson and a global pedophile entrapment and blackmail racket. That is to say, that has got deep inside key people inside the police in the Five Eyes countries and the military, like Mark Milley and so on. And that's keeping them quiet because they've somehow done something. And the younger you are, the more risks you take. You travel the world, maybe you get drunk one night, you go on drugs, and you find yourself in a situation where you've abused a child and someone has the film, right? So now back to this guy, Louis Freeh. I think he knew by June no later than June, that something was in the cards prior to the 9/11 attack. That is, this outfit, Maximus, had got all of the money it needed to, for example, stand down Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon during the exercise top off on 9/11, orchestrated by Booz Allen. So now this is the
Sorry, David.
power of.
I'm sorry to hold you back here, but there's just so many things in this list that you and I have spoken about so many times. This is a CNN article from 2014 talking about 5 things you didn't know about the crash of TWA Flight 800. And it's talking about Ramzi Youssef. It's talking about the Oklahoma City bombing. It's talking about Pan Am 103, which is our buddy Oliver Buck Revell, and they blamed it on Libya. It's almost like this was a buildup to convincing people that airline terrorism was a thing so that nobody would be surprised when 9/11 happened. And also, didn't Oliver Buck Revell, he resigned kind of right before the TWA crash?
1994, as a senior SES 6, I think, level in counterintelligence and counterterrorism for the FBI, right? Then he seems to have come up to Vancouver. But now, what ties together all of these incidents, I believe, is the parallel narrative expertise of the BBC. That is to say, simultaneously, or even before the crime occurs, the BBC must have prepared a parallel narrative, one to inject in the news to take the public away from the real protagonists of the crime, and the other internally to coordinate the 3 essential intelligence networks necessary to attempt to pull off the overthrow of the United States government: signals intelligence, human intelligence, and financial intelligence. Over to you.
Yeah, people in the comments are saying, David, that there's a lot of hints in that list, that CNN article. I can't disagree with that. All of these things seem so related. I mean, you know, you always speak about Jamie Gorelick, or Jamie Gorelick, as you like to call her. She came up in the conversation with Jack Cashel yesterday about TWA 800. It's definitely something I want to learn some more about, but just staying on Trudeau, I was searching Yandex, which is an alternative to Google, and I found an article here that maybe I haven't seen before from 2018. But when's the last time we heard any news about Christopher Charles Ingvaldson? He's kind of keeping a low profile.
I believe he did 4 years in jail, and then he's been released. So he's now loose and fancy free. And I imagine he continues to run an international pedophile ring that connects the SOS children's villages. And I believe the BBC's Studios network. Remember, within the BBC, they had the equivalent, only over a much longer time, of the Christopher Charles Ingvaldson. They had Jimmy Savile, who, for 5 decades, was engaged in continuous assaults on children, and I believe blackmailing, including blackmailing members of the royal family. Now, the tendency is, I believe, it's human nature, to go after the pedophile abuser, right? And I believe they call them in English slang nonces, right? And if a nonce goes into a prison with heterosexual, regular kinds of prisoners, they'll kill him, right? So they have to be isolated. So being accused of being a nonce is a pretty terrifying experience, especially if you're not one. But in the BBC, that kind of individual was almost celebrated. I mean, I believe Jimmy Savile had a career with the BBC for 5 decades. And remember, you and I visited the BBC. We went across the road into the Langham Hotel. And the Langham Hotel would be an extraordinary example of how you can use signals intelligence to your advantage, because it was commissioned in 1865, the year Abraham Lincoln was murdered. And it was the first grand hotel in Europe, had hot and cold running water and hydraulic elevators. But more to the point, it had a telegraph room and a post office. And I believe that was the first hotel to have a telegraph office. It was run by a Confederate officer, I think, starting in 1869, right? And it would go on to be the place where uh, um, Arthur Conan Doyle and the guy who was accused of pedophilia, the picture of Dorian Gray, the name escapes me, Oscar Wilde,
Oh, yeah.
right? Oscar Wilde and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he wasn't a thing, had dinner together with um, a magazine, the Fillicut or the Connecticut or some name of a magazine from Philadelphia, I think around that 1888 period. Now, isn't that an interesting dinner? One of the great writers of detective stories, a great fantasist and probable pedophile, Oscar Wilde, and you've got those two at the Langham Hotel, where directly opposite or kitty corner to the BBC Broadcasting House, with its bizarre images of the power of pedophilia. So if you go to the right on the screen there, the next image I think is really interesting because it shows Prospero with his legs almost around the little naked boy holding a flute, standing on the globe. And I think what the BBC is saying as a kind of not too discreet Fabian message is institutional pedophilia will control the world. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but haven't they succeeded? Because who's been arrested in the, let's say, the Ghislaine Maxwell, or any of the Johns that were partaking of the children who were flown out to the little St. John's Island, where I think one day they'll need to exhume the land on that island, and I think they will find graves of children who were murdered courtesy of Jeffrey Epstein and his pedophile cronies, and for the purposes of blackmail and controlling, or the control of your leaders. Over to you.
Yeah, I tend to agree, David, that the things that we've heard in the news and in the public about Jeffrey Epstein are probably the least egregious things that he's done, and there's probably a lot of stuff that's happened that we haven't yet heard. So it's just coming out today that a new trove of Ghislaine Maxwell court documents have been released. This is a pretty interesting trial. This is Giuffre v. Maxwell. 52 documents were released overnight. They mostly relate to a long-settled defamation lawsuit filed by one of Epstein and Maxwell's most outspoken accusers, Virginia Roberts Giuffre. I'm very suspicious of these civil lawsuits. You know, Dershowitz is involved in all this stuff. Finally, we're getting some transparency. There is some hope, Giuffre tweeted after Manhattan federal judge Loretta Preska announced her decision to release them. I sat in the court there with Judge Preska and Dersh when all of this sort of started. We must maintain vigilant. I think they mean remain vigilant in order for the truth to see the light of day, tweeted Giuffre, who repeatedly claimed she was made to have sex with powerful men, including Prince Andrew. Now look at this. Here's an important message from Jeffrey to Ghislaine. Would be helpful to have something redacted come to Palm Beach today to stay here and help train new staff with Ghislaine. Doesn't look like a man's handwriting to me. It looks like a secretary trying to write it very neatly, and a female, if I were to guess.
Right, right. Well, I think you'd raised the subject that you want to look at TWA 800. What I think now, if it is valid to connect the initiation of SOS Children's Villages in 1949 through to the development of parallel narrative techniques at the BBC. So you can take any incident, let's say a mass casualty event or a high value assassination. And that's what I do, just to help our listeners understand my MO, if you will. I first of all start to see if the BBC has a documentary where they're releasing information of a granularity that implies insider knowledge, right? So many of the BBC's documentaries provide an extraordinary insight into what they know and what they don't know. So, for example, the BBC documentary Contagion exclamation mark shows precisely how the BBC would like to persuade the public about the vectors that carry an infection. So in the case of Contagion exclamation mark, the BBC downloads or builds a program or an app that downloads onto a mobile that then measures through GPS the distance you might be, or this woman, Hannah Fry, in your image there, that she might be from someone else who's also downloaded the app. And what the GPS and artificial intelligence algorithms do, they infer from the distance between them and the length of time they stay close that the digital virus is transmitted from her mobile to the other party's mobile. And then you can take that data and generate a simulation. But the important thing that the public must understand eventually is the simulated digital virus has got nothing to do with the physical virus that is spread by human contact or coughing and spluttering over some other party. So what the BBC has done brilliantly is actually conflate two sources of data. One is the digital infection that's carried on through or developed by artificial intelligence algorithms, some of them developed by Neil Ferguson, who's a charlatan of the first order. And they're conveying to the public, right, the data of the body counts, for example, driven by the simulated data. So if you Google BBC spread contagion, you'll see charts and graphs and so on that indicate how many people are believed to have died if you listen to the BBC. So they've just passed through now 4 million dead. Well, that's a fair number of dead people, right? And that graph then is conveyed to the public through BBC propaganda, and the public is literally driven into panic purchasing of vaccines. Now, just because, you know, time is running. Well, it's not even
panic purchasing, David. They're basically forcing everybody to have to get it. Different countries have already started doing that.
And you and I have been discussing Maximus for a long time, because when Dr. Ortiz wrote his thesis, Bowing to Quirinus, Compromised Nodes in East African Security, in the preamble to the thesis, he said something about the internet has been proven to be a very good tool for information at a distance. And I use it, obviously, and you do, a great deal to trawl around to look at reference information. And what he says in the thesis, and that's absolutely important, what it hasn't been used for up to now, or historically recognized, is action at a distance. Well, what the BBC has done with this is it's taking action at a distance, and it's literally grooming the public to believe, and I'm not saying there isn't a virus, but it's grooming the public into believing that the virus is breaking out in New York or whatever it is, and the public is then responding by, for example, introducing quarantine for the members of the public in New York. And if I may, I'll just read a little clips from the Maximus role in the administration or the business model for the vaccine and the virus situation. So in April of 2020, that's last year, and I use, this is my word, Maximus captures, because I believe Maximus has taken control at a distance of the Vaccine Order Management Contact Center, VOMCC, for 64 immunization programs, more than 44,000 provider sites, 6 vaccine manufacturers, and CDC's centralized distributor. So rhetorically, I ask the question, isn't then Maximus in control of the data which is driving the response to COVID-19? Right? Then 2020 April, Maximus captures, my words, the state of New York COVID-19 screening and scheduling contract. Well, doesn't that mean the shutdown in New York was driven by Maximus shareholders with $18 trillion of funds under management? Right? So, well, I mean, the issue here is Maximus appears to control both vaccine distribution and contract tracing of people deemed to have been infected or at risk of infection from this COVID-19.
David, look at this. Reston-based Maximus gets $951 million contract for national COVID hotline. That's certainly a lot of money from somebody who wants people to be calling that hotline. And, you know, you financially incentivize something and people are going to find a way to make it happen. They want people calling this line. Reston-based government services company Maximus has received a potential $951 million contract to support the CDC and Prevention's Center for Disease Control and Prevention's COVID-19 National Surge Support and Vaccine Assistance Hotline. So wait a minute. This is a surge support hotline. What are they doing to support the surge, David?
Stimulating it.
It seems probable.
And remember, at the same time, Maximus runs your Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act, right, and your Asset Forfeiture Fund, right?
Wow.
And it's operating at a distance because hidden behind Maximus are its ETF shareholders, right? State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock. Those three ETF shareholders have $18 trillion of funds under management, assets under management, and they control my old company, Schlumberger. They control Raytheon, they control Northrop Grumman, they control Pfizer, they control Costco, Maxar, Microsoft, et cetera, et cetera. So all these corporations, ostensibly independent, are joined at the hip, right, through the exchange-traded funds, and that's what gives you action at a distance. So the Fabian socialists have actually taken over the Five Eyes countries by two, what I would describe as human intelligence and signals intelligence networks. The human intelligence network being SOS children's villages and potentially groomed as pedophile entrapment experts. The BBC, through its studios and contracts with third parties like HBO Max and Netflix and so on, is producing parallel narratives. I think this year they're going to have 911, the 20th anniversary. And we're going to use this sickening term, it's a tragedy. Yeah, it's a tragedy. But first and foremost, it's a crime scene. And those graves, with those residential graves, for me, I saw in the paper today, the province, they're talking about to dig or not to dig. And the elders, influenced by Trudeau, of course, are wondering whether it's appropriate to dig up the remains. Well, it damn well is, because some of those children were murdered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How can they say, is it appropriate or not appropriate? David, I'm still interested in finding out, you know, who did the scanning. It's not like everybody's got a ground penetrating radar in the garden shed. Somebody must have commissioned that. And I mean, I want to know, because it's got to be investigated. How can they question if they're going to dig or not to dig? One other thing I want to show you here, David, I'm trying to use a lot of different search engines to find some stuff that we're looking for, because it seems like, you know, they like to scrub data. This is Microsoft Bing. And when you look for Justin Trudeau and Ingvaldson for news about those guys, Microsoft's not able to find anything about that. What do you think of that?
Right. Microsoft is a Maximus. I call a company a Maximus company because Maximus has got these extraordinary contracts, for example, on controlling the supply chains of vaccines and contact tracing for people suspected of having got COVID-19. And it's got the contract with the deadbeat parents, meaning it can extort concessions from deadbeat parents if they don't do what they're told. And it's got the contract with the Asset Forfeiture Fund, which links them through to all of the big crime groups that historically would have been linked up through Phantom Secure or Sky Global. So Maximus
construction crew is back to drilling here, David.
Oh, does that mean we can't continue? Or?
No, we can. Sir Batter says that Maximus is the original name of the Orsini family. Do you know anything about that?
Well, it may be. It's also the original name of Fabius Maximus, the Roman general, who's the hero of the Fabians, because he decided he wouldn't take on Hannibal in the Alps with the elephants. He'd harassed their supply chain, and he went down to North Africa and sacked Carthage. Well, on 911, isn't it a rerun of the United States Air Force was pulled off position into Canada and Alaska, and let me just say as a preamble, I think Canada is a #1 enemy of the United States under the Trudeaus. I think the average Canadian, the light's on, but no one's in, right? They're quite happy just, taking their masks on or taking their masks off. But the Fabians represent, the Trudeaus represent an existential threat to the survival of the Republic. And at the moment, you're losing.
We are. And then
Yes.
we also, a lot of people have brought to my attention that the Fabians have changed their logo or their mascot or whatever the hell this is from the wolf in sheep's clothing to this turtle who moves at a very slow, incremental kind of pace. And then when he strikes hard. What do you think about that?
Well, absolutely. And remember, Trudeau, to patriate the Constitution, he instituted what are called sequential move games, which is sort of...
Did he call it that?
Yeah, in 1980, in order to go province by province and get them to relinquish their powers and have the Constitution patriated from the United Kingdom to Canada, right? And that's a process of gradually socializing province by province. And now, for example, there's a key word that was disappeared between the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights and the Trudeau-Chrétien Charter of Rights and Freedoms that is absolutely fundamental. The word property has disappeared.
Word property has disappeared. Trudeau, what is it? Trudeau's name is on the
Trudeau-Chrétien
Constitution.
Charter of Rights and Freedoms,
which
is the document. Sorry.
But I'm saying, so Trudeau's name is now somehow associated with the Canadian Constitution?
No, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was introduced as a new kind of wording and replaced the Diefenbaker, who was a Prime Minister, Bill of Rights. And the Charter of Rights and Freedoms drops the word property. And I believe it opens up Canada to becoming a Fabian dictatorship, if you will. Right?
Yeah.
Because there's no appeal within law. But again, I think I digress. The original title that we're working with involves this idea of incubation. I think SOS Children's Villages, prior to that, the Indian residential schools and their equivalent in the United States under Bill Clinton have been used to groom a revolutionary guerrilla organization that is now in a position, if it hasn't already done so, to overthrow the Republic and the Five Eyes countries by force, using seemingly little things. Obviously it's a major event like 911, where really the underlying message to we the people is the police and the military intelligence can't protect you.
But David,
right?
Isn't that list we saw on CNN of these various terrorist attacks, individual bombings taken on their own, but it creates a timeline of incremental events that, create this sense that yes, terrorism is everywhere, bombing and planes blowing up, and we have to be very afraid of this. Let's let the FBI do everything in the DOJ. We're going to have to break here, David. We're about to begin our sponsor exclusive segment on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi, and subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. Before we do that, I want to remind everybody, David, they can watch our YouTube simulcasts on the new David Hawkins Reverse CSI YouTube channel. We're well over 1,000 subscribers on there now, so thanks to everyone who's been subscribing, and thanks to the viewers who are joining us on the live stream there. People can also, David, go to your excellent website, which is at reversecciscripts.com. People can join you there, read all about your posts and everything, and also follow you on Twitter at CSI Hawkins. 900 followers, David. Very nice. Soon you will be hitting 1,000 on the internet cesspit that is Twitter. But it's still a good way for people to interact with you. And we need to use these enemy networks to stay in communication with everybody who's on there. They've captured these things. And so hopefully people will sponsor us and join us on Subscribestar and Patreon. We'll be back in just about 5 minutes. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation there. Thanks everybody for watching.